So welcome to the environmental session for today. Just pick up my pen, excuse me. It's been a pretty hectic day, but I guess this is one of the sessions that will get a chance to fill somewhat of a void when it comes to understanding the impacts of climate resilience and how it impacts everything we do pretty well. We have three speakers in this session. First, I'll just read their bios out. So introduce them collectively at the moment, and then I'll call up the speakers as they come up in turn. Deanna Marshall has worked in conservation for the past 20 years, with a main focus on production of grasslands and all creatures that live within them. She currently works with the Trust of Nature, a statutory authority that works with private landholders to place conservation covenants over their land. Paul Dettmann, and I'm just talking with Paul a minute ago. He has a number of hats, but in this particular instance, he is here talking about his involvement with Cassinia, his business, environmental business, and all things to do. Paul hails from Kyneton, so I'll actually let Paul do a better introduction of what he'll be talking about today. And then lastly, we have Caroline Welsh, who is no stranger to many of you. And just running quickly through Caroline Welsh's session, she'll be actually giving us a rundown on what it means in running a carbon neutral event. So what are the key aspects of that? Caroline has been a member of the BCG board here since 2007 and chairman from 2012 until 2019. She lives in Berrywillick and is a partner in the family grains farm with husband John and cousins Kim and Mari. Caroline is also a director of GMW Water and member of the Loddon Mallee Regional Development Australia Committee. Caroline has a degree in agricultural science and Master of Marketing and Agribusiness. She worked in irrigation horticulture section of the Department of Primary Industries in Swan Hill for 19 years in the areas of industrial development, export marketing, extension, irrigation and climate. Caroline received a Churchill Fellowship in 1998, travelling to Asia, South Africa and Chile to investigate markets and competitors of the Swan Hill fresh fruit export. Now, the speaker's order is firstly we will have Deanna, followed by Paul and then Caroline. They'll each have around about 20 minutes each to speak, and that'll be followed by a panel session for questions at the end of that time. So, Deanna, over to you.
Hello. So I work for Trust for Nature. Trust for Nature was established in 1972 with the primary purpose to actually protect and restore nature on private properties. And we own 43 conservation reserves in Victoria, and we work with over 1,400 conservation covenantors. I am here today to talk about the outstanding global significance of Plains wanderer, which is a critically endangered Australian icon species. Effective conservation actions of this bird is actually really vital because based on their evolutionary distinctiveness and the extinction risk, they've actually been ranked number one in the world amongst nearly 10,000 recognised bird species. They're actually the sole member of the family of birds Predominidae, excuse the Latin. They are an ancient Gondwanan survivor. Plains wanderer relatives were in Australia over 30 million years ago. The only other Australian vertebrate species with a similar global ranking would have been the Tassie tiger. So the national and Victorian status of the bird is actually critically endangered. The Plains wanderer's Latin name is Pedinomus torquatus, and Pedinomus is actually Greek for mean haunting the fields, and we'll see later if I can play the call what that haunting the fields actually sounds like. And torquatus is actually Latin for wearing a necklace, and you can see the female bird there with the rufous chest. She's got kind of like a pretty necklace on. Really unusual biology. So the females are larger and much more brightly coloured, and defend their territories. They're about as tall as your hand when they're standing on their tippy toes, but in a normal pose like this where they're squatting, they're only about the size of your fist. They eat a really diverse array of seeds and insects in native grasslands, and females can pair with 2 males in the same season, unusual in the bird world. The home range is only between 9 and 12 hectares, with about 400 metres between their territories, so they can actually live in a fairly small area, provided they've got the resources. So the males actually do all the sitting on the eggs and incubating of the chicks, and they rear between 2 and 5 chicks, mainly in spring. The plains wanders occur predominantly in sparse native grasslands on red soil and rarely in the denser grey soils that we do see around the plains. They are sedentary, provided the structure of their native grasslands is not greatly altered. However, marked changes in the grassland structure are common, and that means that they can actually leave to find a better home. We think the juveniles can actually disperse up to 40 kilometres, but one banded male was recently recorded 124 kilometres from Terek National Park, where it was banded. It was found in the New South Wales riverina. They know that they can live up to 10 years in captivity. And the historical distribution, so the main stronghold, or the colours that you can see here, the green ones were, I think, prior to 1977, and it's really contracted to the red dots, which are our records from 1993 to 2015. So the main stronghold is actually the New South Wales riverina and the north central Victoria, and to a lesser extent there's still a population in South Australia and one in Queensland. But they're pretty much extinct everywhere else. And more than half of the 140 records of plains wanderers that came in during the 1890 to 1940 period were actually on Melbourne's Victorian volcanic plains, so you can imagine most of that habitat is now gone. So on Victoria's northern plains is mainly where we're working with this bird, because they are present at the moment. So the Patho Plains, which is between Terek National Park and Echuca, there's a lot of farmers that we work with out there and landholders, and also Parks Victoria that have conservation reserves where these birds hang out. To a lesser extent, we're finding them west of Kerrang in very small numbers, and we haven't yet had a location yet around the Bunjaluk, which is Tawinini, Ninanyuk area. And you'll see later that I have been working in this area looking for the birds that were previously recorded here as well. So grassland structure is absolutely vital. Sparse native grasslands on the red soils, critical habitat. It's overwhelmingly more important to have the right structure than all the different various flora species in the grasslands. That's an example of, if we do ever have a spring on the left, that's what it might look like. At the moment, most of it's crunchy on the right. That's what habitat looks like. So you can see the red soils, the cracks in the soils and the spaces between the native grass tussocks. That's ideal habitat. This is an example where habitat we might have thought was a little bit too thick, but it was actually showing that the plains wanderers were utilising this grassland to nest in, where they had a little bit more cover. So there's actually a nest in that picture with the eggs in it. The main threats have been habitat loss. This is an example of the Patho Plains. The red areas are all habitat that's been lost. The yellow areas are the areas that we're working with farmers at the moment, and the green areas are areas that have been secured in the National Reserve System. So in 1993, Dr. David Baker-Gabb, who's the authority on plains wanderers, identified 24 priority sites. More than 50% have been lost to cultivation. And they've been further prioritised again, but it's clearly showing that's been the main driver towards this species becoming critically endangered. This is actually around the Bunjaluk Tawinini area, and it's the same story here. So we're yet to find birds out at this area at the moment, even though they were previously recorded there. Around Birchip, I think about 20 years ago, there was actually 8 birds found on 4 properties here. We haven't been able to relocate any birds yet, although we're trying, and we hope to continue trying over the next couple of years. Hopefully, I have found 2 sites where I think that they could still be present. The habitat is suitable, but we just haven't located the birds yet, so we'll keep trying. Working with the Birchip Landcare Group to implement a NLP2 project with the Mallee CMA. So some of the threats on the left is a farm that's a great example of overgrazing. So these are like, some people are likening them to Goldilocks and the 3 bears. That's just got to be right, the habitat. And that is, that's overgrazing on the left. This is an example of what happens when we don't have grazing, which is just as much as a threat as overgrazing. Some of the predators, the plains wanderers won't venture within 200 metres of a tree that's about 8 metres high because of predatory birds. So plains wanderers prefer not to fly. They can, but they prefer not to. And here we have the black falcon, the brown falcons pictured on the left, a wedge-tailed eagle, and the spotted harrier on the right are all active predators of plains wanderers. A lot of people ask us about foxes. Our fox bait takes actually went up at the same time our plains wanderer numbers did. So the birds are so cryptic that they can hide from predators like a fox. I'm sure foxes do take them if they find them. They look very edible. They're so cute and fluffy, but they're not the main threat to the plains wanderers. Rabbits are, because they attract the birds of prey. So the most effective work that we can do on the farms that we're working on is control boxthorn and rabbits. As an example of a massive undertaking over 1,000 hectares of boxthorn removal. I think in the order of 1,700 boxthorns were removed from some of the prime habitat we have on the Patho Plains. Examples of fencing to soil type. So a lot of the farmers that we work with are fencing their properties to soil type, which allows them to manage the red soil for plains wanderers and the grey soil differently. We have been using these song meters, so I do have song meters deployed with the Birchip Landcare Group in this region. The song meters, we worked with the zoo and the museum, and they designed a software program that we install these song meters. It records noise in the morning for an hour and in the evening for 2 hours, and we take the little chip after 6 months out of the song recorder and put it into a software program that pulls out what it thinks is a plains wanderer. Haven't quite got it right yet, because the more calls that we feed into the recognition software, the better it'll become. So we're in the infancy at the moment. We still have to check what the computer thinks is a plains wanderer call. And so we spend hours listening to magpies and flies and mozzies and occasionally a farmer singing when he's near our song meter. We have to give him a heads up that the song meter's actually turned on at that time. It's all good. Sheep and cows, obviously, we hear a lot of too. On the right, if we're working with farmers that have cattle, we put these constructions over them. On the left, all the spikes and everything is sticking out to stop magpies from destroying our little windsocks, which they're very good at. I'll just see, I have got the sound grab.
Plains wanderer.
There you go. If you ever hear it, ring me. So as I said, we get thousands and thousands of calls on these song meters, runs it through the software program, and occasionally it'll spit out this. And so we actually visually look at that recording and we can see that those bars along the ground and the right megahertz, sometimes they have a little curvature up and that'll be a pigeon. So we still have to listen to them. And so we listen to that. When we get it, it's like, yes, we mark it down and we know that there's plains wanderers there. We look for properties that maybe have 20 or more calls on the property because we know that the plains wanderer, that's the female, by the way, that's calling. We know that the population might be looking to stay in that paddock. Sometimes they might lob into a paddock, they might call looking for a mate, they might not hear anything and they'll move on again. So if we have less than 20 calls, we might think, maybe they're not staying in that paddock. But apparently people do hear this in the field. In 20 years, I've never seen a plains wanderer during the day and I've never heard the call, but I'm still out there listening for it, hopefully. We are working with the zoo, like I said, Taronga Zoo in Sydney, Featherdale Wildlife Sanctuary in Sydney, and Zoos South Australia and Zoos Victoria are all doing a captive breeding program. Critically endangered species are one step away from becoming extinct, so it's a really drastic action that all the states have agreed upon to actually captively breed these birds. We do have babies in the zoo at the moment, and now we have to determine and work with the landholders about where they're going to be released. This is some of the interesting observations from the zoo that we don't usually get to see because we don't get to watch these birds during the day. You can barely find them in a paddock during the day. This is a female undertaking some wing flapping. The zoo's named all these different helicopter flight stories that they're observing. The birds actually lift up over the grasses to see where their predators are like this. Normally in the wild we would say that grass was too long in their paddock, so I have no doubt that they spring up to see what's going on in the area. They've also got fabulous footage online of all the chicks that they've been breeding, which is really great to see. Working with the Northern Plains farmers, they did make lots of recommendations to help other farmers manage plains wanderers. You know, the biggest thing for us is to avoid cultivation in the first place if you've got a native grassland, and fertiliser application. Maintaining a grazing regime. This is so important. We need you to have stock on your grasslands, but we need you to farm to the seasons. Some of the farmers say that 3 weeks post 50 mil of rain is the ideal time to put the stock back into the paddock. We need to conserve the red soil. Red soils are very delicate. Often they've got a wonderful soil crust. Leave cover over summer. It's really hard to get cover back if you bear a paddock out over summer. Graze early in a wet year. We saw in 2010-11 a horrendous amount of grass growth in our paddocks that actually rendered the plains wanderer had a 95% population drop in Victoria because of the rain and not enough grazing. Fencing to soil type, and some of the farmers we work with are protecting their grassland paddocks with a conservation covenant with Trust for Nature, and just recently this is Andy and Judy McGilvray that protected their property under a conservation covenant. And I think that is it. This is just great examples of really good habitat, really good habitat. And this is a plains wanderer expert, Dr. David Baker-Gabb, that works with us where I get all my information from. Just very quickly, sorry, I have left a few flyers out the back. This is a really good one if you are a local landholder anywhere in Victoria. This is grassland bird species as well as plains wanderers, so you can tell the difference between all your different quails that you might see because they are kind of quail-like. And a fact sheet that we just produced last year with the Mallee CMA on the Birchip area and plains wanderers. So thank you.
I wish I could get my timing that good. Paul, over to you. We'll just hold our questions, as I said, till we'll have a panel at the end of the Caroline session, actually.
Thanks, Dee. That was very inspiring. I feel like what I've got to say now will be pretty boring by comparison, but I'll just wanted to go through today. So my name's Paul Dettmann. My company is Cassinia Environmental, and we do a range of projects. We've sort of started out looking at carbon, revegetation for carbon, and did a fair bit of work with Graham Anderson down here at the front back in 2005 or something like that when we first started out. And since then we've sort of moved in, done a fair bit with biodiversity offsets, and we've got a bunch of other innovative sort of landscape scale, climate resilience focused projects that I thought I'd just skip through, and then maybe when we get to questions, if there's anything that's particularly interesting, people might like to jump in and ask some specifics about. I just thought, I heard a great analogy the other day, which was that there's 1 million pieces in an aeroplane, apparently, or approximately, And if you knew that something was missing, that one piece of the aeroplane was missing, would you still fly on it? And you probably would. And what if you knew there was 2 pieces missing, or 10, or 100, or 1,000? You know, what's the point at which you go, well, I'm a bit unsure about the security of this aircraft. Then the analogy was made that with the ecosystem that we live in and rely on could be compared to an aeroplane, and how many pieces can we afford to sort of pull out before the system collapses? And you guys are, I mean, I'm a 6th generation farmer from Central Victoria, and you guys are no doubt mostly farming, and you know that the way systems work and that the systems are pretty resilient in many ways. But I think the analogy holds true, and I think the idea that we'd want to pull out as few pieces as we could would certainly resonate with everyone. So it's sort of that analogy is valuable, I think. I was at a presentation recently by Bush Heritage, and they were talking about this little moth, the Eltham copper butterfly, and the complexity of this relationship. I don't know if anyone knows the Eltham copper butterfly. I'd have to say that I didn't know much about it until I went to this presentation, but it's a really interesting symbiotic relationship between the moth, which is a caterpillar, which the eggs of the caterpillar, the eggs of the moth, get laid on the Basaria plant, and then as the larvae hatch, they are coaxed down the plant by these ants, and I can't remember the specific species name of the ants, but I'm sure Deanna knows. And they're milked for a secretion that they give off underground, and they're sort of cared for by the ants, and then they come out, they weave their cocoon, they become the butterfly. Now, this is an incredibly interesting and incredibly complex relationship, and this is one of the ones we do understand. And we think about the ones that we don't understand. What might else be going on there? What relationship might some mycorrhiza have with the ants, and what might else be going on that we haven't even discovered yet? I just think it's interesting. The aeroplane analogy is interesting, and the complexity of the relationships is sort of daunting and interesting, and gives us pause to think about the way we manage the environment. I won't dwell too much on this, but this sort of gives a bit of a snapshot of potentially the problem too. Only 50% of bushland remains intact. Australia is a deforestation hotspot, etc., etc. So that's sort of a picture of the problem, and I just wanted to look at some opportunities for the future too, sort of as a counterpoint to that problem, and then look at a few things that we've got involved in that way. I think that even though there's a big problem, there's a real possibility of good stuff. We've got attitudes are changing. There's a wide-ranging recognition of the environmental crisis, and that's not in the sky's falling in sense, but in a sense that we know what it is that we're dealing with. A recognition of the intrinsic value of nature, which I think is pretty fundamental to the way we view nature. And then we've got consumers who are getting more educated about the way we view our food and our fibre. And the economics are changing too. And the place that we've played mostly in is this environmental market space. So there's become an emerging opportunity for markets to sort of deliver better possibilities around carbon, biodiversity, water quality, and other things. Just in the terms of the context of this, at Cassinia we've sort of got 3 ways that we look at things. We try to find projects that can protect what's left. Thought that was great, Deanna, like looking at what's happened around here with the loss of grasslands. So, there's a great opportunity still to protect the last bits of what's left, even though most of it's gone. We look at opportunities where we can restore degraded landscapes and also reconnect fragmented landscapes. So just quickly flick through a couple of these. Actually, this is in terms of protecting what's left, this is a project that we've done down in south of the Grampians, down near Myman, between Hamilton and Portland, protecting a wetland, quite a significant project. We've protected some land around Mount Corong, which is a grassy woodland, and we weren't the first people to discover this orchid, but Bush Heritage have a reserve close by, and they discovered it first. But this was a formerly declared extinct orchid, the robust greenwood. So it's great to be able to protect the habitat of the orchid. And then we're right into restoration as well. So we've done about 4,000 hectares of revegetation, and this is just a little example of one of the sites we did. You can see slide on the left, pretty eroded landscape, pretty degraded cropping, but very marginal cropping country. And 6 years later, we planted it out, and you can see that already the erosion's certainly not as dramatic as it was, and the trees are certainly coming back. And I should have a look. We just did a flyover with a drone recently, and it looks pretty spectacular. Just in the restoration, I won't harp on this, but I've also been involved in similar types of projects to this in Africa, and we got the first project accredited under the Kyoto Protocol in the forestry space in Africa, which was in Ethiopia, and there's a bit of a before and after of that project. Really interesting World Bank partnership. And then in terms of the restoration, this is a hillside. We've restored about 450 acres of metamorphic ridge in central Victoria, quite close to where we live. Then in terms of reconnection, we've focused a lot on the Inglewood Wedderburn sort of area, and I just put this up as a bit of an example. We've got a goal to reconnect the Grampians through to Gunbower National Park, and a focal point, or one of the focal points, has been this area. So you can see we've sort of been joining some dots. There's still plenty of dots to join, but we've been partnering up with some other landholders as well. And so moving to the northeast of this site, of this sort of slide, effectively almost connecting Brannanna right through to the Loddon River. So it'd be about a 25 or 30 kilometre corridor that we'll have completed relatively soon. Just thought I'd flick through our story really quickly. So just in terms of what we've done about 50 projects. We've been working for about 15 years on this. Done about 50 projects across 4 states. We've purchased 38 properties across a range of landscapes. We're Trust for Nature's, that's our favourite claim to fame, Trust for Nature's largest covenant partner. And we're just looking at options to build sustainable revenue streams in these different sort of marketplaces that could lead to environmental restoration. We've purchased and protected about 8,000 hectares across those properties. We reckon we've sequestered, or will sequester, about 500,000 tonnes of carbon in these tree planting projects that we've done. That estimate is a pretty big estimate, 15 to 20 million trees and plants established, but certainly when you're working at that scale and we do a lot of direct seeding, it's certainly possible to get some pretty big numbers pretty quickly. And we've protected habitat for over 40 different threatened species, including Plains Wanderer, actually. Just thought I'd run quickly through a few case studies of the types of projects we've got involved in. So this was actually the first property we bought. It's called Corong Ridge Conservation Estate. It was nearly 1,000 hectares. It was cropping and grazing, but it had a big granite ridge that ran through the middle of it that had never been cleared because it couldn't really be cleared. Probably about 2/3 of the property, though, had been grazed and been cropped. It was a granite soil, so it was a fairly marginal, fairly eroded landscape, and you can sort of see from that aerial photo, even though it's pretty low quality, you can sort of see there's a fair bit of erosion on that little photo on the right. We purchased it, we covenanted. I think it's Trust for Nature's largest covenant cluster, this property. It doubled the size of the Mount Corong Reserve. We entered into a voluntary carbon agreement with the trees that we planted, and then we subdivided. It was in about 15 titles, and we took it back to 8 titles. We kept a little domestic area of about 15 acres on each of those, and then they were 250 acre lots, so we had about 235 acres of each of those was permanent conservation protection. And then we sold it, and yeah, it's been a really interesting project and also a really interesting social project to see the way these 8 like-minded landholders have got together and really managed this ongoing. Oops, wrong direction. We're doing a similar one at the moment. We're in the middle of this between the Werribee Gorge and the Brisbane Ranges, and the white dotted lines are really just the districts. I should have taken that off that slide, but the blue in the middle is the project that we're delivering, and we're trying to connect the Brisbane Ranges to the south through to the Werribee Gorge in the north. It's about a 1,000 acre project, 1,100 acre project, and it'll involve planting about 300,000 trees, and then doing a similar approach to what we did at Mount Coorong, with bringing in about 10 different landholders to manage it in future. We managed to be part of the story of a bit of cool temperate rainforest, number of threatened species on it. This was an offset project, but it was great to be able to be part of the protection of some of the last remaining parts of cool temperate rainforest protection. This is another one. This is that, I was just talking to Dee about this branding. We've purchased a property actually close by to us, and that photo is not from that property. Somebody else has helped me pull this presentation together, but it looks pretty much similar. We've purchased a property that has significant population of golden sun moth, and it like the Plains Wanderer, requires some grazing. So we're managing this large project for agriculture, but in the context of how we maximise the value for biodiversity for the sun moth. And in doing that, we've created this brand, and I think this is a really interesting way for landholders to really, I guess, monetise potentially or get rewarded for the work they're doing, is this protected habitat brand. So we stuck that on our wool when we sold the wool at the wool sale in Melbourne, and I've been selling wool for a while, not heaps of time, but maybe 10 years. We've never topped the market before, and we topped the market with this particular sale. And I would think we had to talk to some of the wool buyers after the auction, and they felt that this was a valuable addition, a valuable brand to tell our story, which obviously we're telling there with Trust for Nature is involved in that story. Another project we're doing, we're interested in the potential for the Birchip cropping group. This would be an interesting sort of curveball, but interested in wattle seeds as a potential food source. And wattle seed is sort of, you see it around as a flavouring, but we think we've set up the first sort of commercial scale trial. We're putting in about 35 hectares of wattle down at Hamilton, and we're working with a plant breeder who actually bred Avalon ryegrass, and he sort of turned his attention to breeding some cultivars of a few different species of wattle seed that will, give good yields, but also hold their seed well. But there's some really interesting upsides to this if we could make it work. And we're talking about, yields of maybe, 500 to 1,000 kilos a hectare. So not comparable to some other crops, but could be a really valuable part of the food production piece for Australia. High protein, low requirement for fertilisers, good biodiversity benefits, and store a lot of carbon, as well as no soil disturbance. So we just actually started planting that yesterday. So 5 minutes. I'll just flick through these. It'd be better to have a bit more time for questions. We've got some ambitious goals for the next 5 years. We see the future as to be more about partnerships. We've got some of the puzzle pieces, but we haven't got all of them, and we need to work together to solve some of these really difficult problems. We really see an important future for ag and conservation to be melded together. I think it happens a lot better in other countries than it does in Australia. We think environmental markets are really valuable way to value the services that landholders can provide. And if you're interested in environmental markets and this sort of thing, there's a great paper that was produced by the Australian Land Conservation Alliance, which is available online, and it really digs into the sort of different approaches for creating landscape scale conservation projects. And I got really inspired by this guy, so I wanted to put a slide about him on the presentation somewhere. A good friend of mine grew up with the guy who's on our $50 note, David Uniapan, and he tells a great story. If you're ever down in Rauken, sort of on the bottom side of Lake Alexandrina on the mouth of the Murray, it's a great little community to visit. But written on the $50 note is David's words, which he says, "As a full-blooded member of my race, I think I may claim to be the first, but I hope not the last, to produce an enduring record of our customs, beliefs and imaginings." And Clyde, my friend who grew up with David, he was a little kid when David passed away, really unpacks that idea of imagining, of dreaming and finding new solutions for people, for the environment and the planet. Anyway, feel free to quiz me about any of these projects later on. And it's a great privilege to be able to share all this with you. Thanks.
That's really good. That actually gives us a little bit of breathing space for questions later, so well done. Caroline, now I'm really keen to actually hear about a carbon neutral, and I believe that the aim was to make this event a carbon neutral event. So I'm pretty keen to find out how you got on.
Thanks, Glenn. Yes, I can say that we are a fully certified carbon neutral event. I've been banding it around, our trademark that we're able to use because we've been through the process. And I'm here today to tell you what it was like. I suppose I better put forward a disclaimer that it's a lot more complicated if you're going to do a bigger event, if you're going to do a different process. I'm just going to share with you what we did for this event and how we found the process, and to give you a few pointers. Hang on. I don't think I pressed anything. There we go. So that was the talk gone. But yeah, we basically thought about making this a carbon neutral event. Obviously, it's the day is very much around climate change and becoming resilient to that. And I suppose reducing our emissions is one way of certainly mitigating the impacts of climate change. And to some extent, there's been a fair amount of talk around the industry about, you might have heard that Meat and Livestock Australia, the red meat industry, is planning to be carbon neutral by 2030. And you think, well, if a few, farting cows can do it, we can probably do it if they can do it for a whole industry, surely we can do it for one little event in Birchip. Did that just go back again? Oh, that's the second slide, I think. Yeah. So in terms of the nuts and bolts about what is required to get the carbon neutral certification, just seems to keep going on, does it? Hang on. There we go. The certification process is administered by the Federal Department of Energy and Environment, and you are assessed based on the National Carbon Offset Standard, which is a UN-recognised standard that has been developed by the federal government, and that's what we are certified under. I'm just going to keep this talk under control. I feel like it's playing games with me, but anyway, I'll stick to it. So obviously, this particular event is under their rules, is considered a small event because I think we've got less than 1,000 people. It's only for one day. So if you were to run an event that had more than 1,000 people, or were running for 2,000 people for more than one day, then you'd be considered a large event. So I can imagine that a lot of people in this room would be running a lot of small events at some stage or other. You can also get certified as carbon neutral for an entire organisation. I haven't told BCG about my plans for that, but you can also get a precinct certified products and services certified and entire buildings certified under this process. So obviously we've just chosen the small event one. And the people in the department who run this are the carbon neutral team. And I'd have to say they're really helpful. The process was relatively pretty simple, but certainly developing a relationship, like with most things, developing a relationship with the carbon neutral team has been really worthwhile. So the process, this is the steps involved. So you've got to work out what your scope of your certification is. So, for example, ours is very much about it's being an event, and we had to decide sort of up front how far we wanted to go. We've actually got another event on tomorrow, which is actually an invited event. So I sort of said, oh, well, we've sort of been working on it together. We'll get it certified for the 2 days. So my scope involved this event today and also tomorrow. So I obviously contacted the carbon neutral team. The next step is basically about getting a licensing agreement, which was between BCG is the responsible entity, and when we'll talk to our organising committee, which obviously involves North Central CMA, Mallee CMA and Bull Oak. Do they want to be involved in the certification? Yes, they did. So part of our licence agreement is between all of those 4 entities and the government about getting this licence to use this trademark. And the licence agreement, we had to pay it up front, and the cost was $800, but we had a 20% discount because BCG is a not-for-profit organisation, so that was a bit of a bonus. And each of the 4 organisations had to fill out an incredibly straightforward one-page document that basically said who we are, what our address is, who's the contact person, and proof that we're a not-for-profit organisation and we've got an ABN number, and pay the $640. Once that happened, the next part of it is preparing the report. They sent me an Excel spreadsheet which had a heap of pages where I could calculate the emissions for different parts of the event. Then they sent me a Word document template, and I had to outline the assumptions that we used, our emissions reduction strategy, what our final carbon account was, and purchasing carbon offsets. And it was literally an Excel spreadsheet that I could muck around with and change and put things in, and even to the extent where you can say, well, this bit's optional, I'll put it in and see what effect it has. Actually, I might keep it out. So it was very easy to use and very straightforward, and there were a number of options that we could use. But I'll go through that in just a minute. So once I'd prepared the Excel spreadsheet, typed up my Word document and sent them in. We got our certification and our ability to use the trademark. And the key thing is that, in theory, they do tell you that you should submit the documents 4 to 6 weeks before your event. Well, I think because I'd developed a bit of a relationship with them, and I'd help them with some tweaks to their spreadsheet, and I'd talk to them on the phone. We pretty well got it done within 2 weeks, because I started this process only about 2 or 3 months ago. So this is basically a summary of our emissions. There are my pens, or someone's pens. Hands up who drove their car here today. Put your hand down if you shared a car with someone else. So all those people here drove, and me too, drove individually. I should have spoken to you, Mari, before we came here. She's the closest person to me. But you can obviously see from this summary that, surprise, surprise, the local transport, which is basically people driving here from all around the region, was one of our biggest emissions. The domestic flights were the second one, and then some of those other ones. But I'll go through each one in step. To be honest, I really had no idea. first time I did the calculation, I'd done something wrong and it said 8,000 tonnes, and I've gone, whoa, okay, no wonder we're in trouble. And then I said, rang the team and recalculated. 8. We can handle that, because obviously part of it is paying for the offsets that we can't get rid of. So in terms of our assumptions, just going through the process of what we had to do to put in our figures for the Excel spreadsheet and the calculator. So we had to make some assumptions around our crowd. We did kind of assume it probably wasn't this demographic crowd, but so like I said, we assumed that it would be over 2 days. We thought that we'd get about 150 people attending today, plus 20 extras, helpers, speakers, so that's about 170 for today. I included tomorrow, so that's basically 200 people across 4 venues. Obviously we've been here, we've been there, and 2 venues at BCG. Like I said, it's pretty flexible. So rather than typing, trying to work out, okay, so I've got 200, because we've been moving all over the place, we've got 200 people, and there's 1 day here, but there's probably going to be half the people here in this venue, and then later on there's going to be maybe 30 in that building, and then 30. I basically just said, right, I'm going to assume we've got 200 people, 2 days, this venue's going to be used all day, and the others are going to be used for half a day. And as long as I was able to show them what my assumptions were, then that's a key part of the report, just letting them know what you've decided to include and whether they're reasonable assumptions. In terms of the travel, obviously, this is the biggest emissions that we produce came from travel. Out of the 200 people, I basically assumed that 5 of them were flying in from interstate. When I look at my Excel spreadsheet, I was actually able to just type in, okay, a return flight from Brisbane for Stuart and a return flight from Adelaide for Peter, etc., etc. 2.5 tonnes worth, and that calculated in the spreadsheet automatically. With the car drivers, we estimated about 186 people would drive from around the region, including Gabrielle, who drove from Canberra. I actually did my own I created an extra page in the spreadsheet, and I said, right, well, we'll probably get maybe 5 people from Warrnambool, and we'll get a few of those CMA people from Bendigo, so I'll say 12 from Bendigo, and I've put in all of my assumptions. We're going to encourage people to share their driving, so I made some assumptions there and put that in the spreadsheet. We did encourage people from Birchip to walk, and we assumed that maybe 10 of them would. Certainly all of the BCG staff were going to be walking. Oh, there you go. Once I've done my assumptions, so we calculated that we would be travelling about 20,000 k's between us all to get here for the 2 days. And that's the calculation that it uses in the spreadsheet to work out how many tonnes of carbon dioxide. So just out of interest, I personally, don't know about anyone else, but I personally do 70,000 k's a year in my car, which equates to about 12.4 tonnes a year just from my car alone. And at about $15 a tonne, if I wanted to offset that carbon, it would cost me $186, which, isn't actually that much, I didn't think, considering how much fuel and how much a car costs to run, for example. An extra $186 to pay someone to offset that carbon, for someone like me, who is, I think, spends a lot of time in the car, isn't that bad. Accommodation was another area that contributes carbon emissions. We assumed that about 15 people would stay the night. The options in Birchip are the pub, the caravan park, and we billeted people in other people's homes. Basically, it's all around, emissions and accommodation are all about the space, the average floor space. So, for example, a 1 to 2 star hotel motel room, for example, the Birchip Hotel, you got 35 metres squared per room, according to the calculator. So that's where our emissions came from. If you've got in a 5-star hotel, they assume you've got 85 metres squared per room. So if you want to save emissions, country pubs are king. Water, food and food waste are also on that list of things we had to do. I had no idea how much water we would use. I knew we were getting it from GWM, but the calculator just lets me use their estimates of 36 litres per person. Obviously, we're not drinking all of that, but that's, toilets and all the other things that they put into the calculator. One thing I didn't mention was that you do get a 74-page National Carbon Offset Events Management booklet that you can look at and read all about the ways and why-fors they've determined their estimates, if you're interested. I was a bit pressed for time, so I was just happy to go with what they'd put, but that information is in the 74-page report. That is very useful to use as you're developing up your emissions. Food emissions, once again, they had an estimate for high emissions and low emissions. One of the estimates around high emissions is basically if you have hot food, which is why today we've had cold food and fruit salad on offer rather than hot food. And we also used their estimates of 10% food waste. Electricity and special lighting was interesting. Actually, we haven't got as much lighting here as we expected, but once again, in terms of electricity, it's all about floor space. We measured up the floor space in this venue, in that venue, the other venues, estimated that this place would be used all day, the others would be used half a day, added it up, stuck it in the calculator, and it came out with an amount. Likewise, we just assumed that we had stage lights in here that would be used for 4 hours, and once again stuck that in the calculator. In terms of trying to reduce our emissions, because any emissions that you don't reduce, you actually have to pay carbon offsets for. In our registrations, we encouraged locals to walk or cycle. We also encouraged people to ride share. When we had speakers who were coming from far away, we certainly encouraged the people to ride share, to come in via video conferencing, which did save us quite a lot of emissions from the people who came from far away, but it probably did cost us an extra, don't listen Joe, but about an extra $1,500 in our video conferencing equipment. They were all included in our calculations. Things that weren't included paper-free registrations, not printing out the program, which was a bit frustrating, but at least we didn't, waste that paper. And we did choose our caterers because they tend to use locally sourced food products. Here's our little table again, just for you to have a look at. That uplift factor down the bottom is basically just a way of sticking in a figure for something that is perhaps out of our control. For example, if 200 people turned up and maybe we all ended up travelling an extra 5,000 kilometres to get here, that's sort of something a bit out of our control, not really sure what impact it would have. Just add an extra tonne on and you pretty well sort of have covered that. So they just give you an option for an uplift factor. And then we purchased some carbon offsets. This is where it did get a bit tricky. They need to be post-2013. They need to be UN standard. It was a bit tricky to work out which ones to use because they're not really meant to, give you a organisation best to work through. But we ended up buying 10 tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalents for the Fiji hydropower project. I went onto a website that met the requirements, and I was really keen to get some Australian offsets. The closest they had were Oceania, and the only Oceania one they had was Fiji. So that cost us US $90 or $144. And actually all I did was type it in the computer, transfer the money literally through my ANZ bank account online, and a week later it was all certified and done. Unbelievably easy. And so the $640 licence fee that went to the federal government to make sure that everything was hunky-dory and to hopefully pay for that lovely carbon neutral team who are really helpful, plus the $145 for our offsets. That's how much it cost us, and for my time, probably about 3 or 4 days. So that's how we became carbon neutral. And the only other thing is that this is our summary report of what we've done and our assumptions and so on. And this is apparently on their website because it's the pre-event public disclosure summary that has to be publicly available on their website. So you can find that if you're interested. And that was it.
Okay, question time. So we got Deanna and Paul to come up and join us. Roving mics are out there. First question. Beautiful. Just while the mic's being transferred, I just want to say you can't put a dollar value on what this stuff was worth going through, in my view anyway, going through this process, given about what we heard today about emissions and what emissions actually mean. Now, yes, thanks.
Given that the food waste thing's huge, did you consider local chooks for the food waste thing for this event?
Oh, in terms of buying them or using them?
For the rind of my watermelon that I didn't know what to do with.
Oh, okay, beg your pardon. No, I didn't.
Some of this happened. Some of the leftovers are going to chips.
Are they? There you go. Someone's thought about it. Terrific.
Caroline, if you're running multiple events, is it a practical process to go through 3 to 4 days for...
Well, actually...
could you do it on a multiple basis?
Yes, you can. And in fact, there's a... I can't remember the phrase they use for it, but that's certainly something that we're considering because BCG run a lot of events every year, and you can get... there is a process where you can basically buy offsets. So, say we bought 100 tonnes of CO2 equivalent offsets, then we could then basically use them sort of over the next 12 months for any other events that we run. And there's also you follow a very similar process, and there is a process in place for running multiple events. And really, this one we just thought we would suck it and see. But considering how relatively straightforward it's been, and I suppose what I should also say is that if I'd done this 12 months ago, it would have been more complicated, and we probably would have had to hire a consultant, which always gets you a bit worried, money-wise, to help us through the process because it was much more complicated. I'm sure it would be a lot more complicated if it was a larger event, but even our main field day, where we get 350, 400 people come every year, that's still considered a small event. And I could have gone to a lot more effort in terms of, for example, with the food, rather than just going high emissions, low emissions, hot or cold. There's a process where you can actually look at everything you've purchased based on that. It was also optional to consider not just food waste, but waste generally. So how many, bins have we actually filled with rubbish, for example? But I just did it the simplest, easiest way I possibly could. But there is definitely a process in place for multiple events, and that's something that BCG will be looking at.
Caroline, I've got a question for you and also for Paul afterwards. It's a great initiative, but with regional communities, we've got no public transport, so it seems we're sort of disadvantaged to start with. You know, you putting on this event, you're likely to cost you a hell of a lot more than someone in Melbourne. Is that something you're sort of advocating? I don't know how you do it, but there's no scope for people to get here by public transport. So, yeah, is that sort of a disincentive to run these events in smaller towns?
Well, no, I suppose it's an incentive to ensure that we do have video conferencing and that we record speakers so that people who don't choose to come or can't come are able to look at them online later on. And it's why we've also got more into podcasts and things like that, so people can get information in different ways. But it is a challenge. There's no way anybody here could have come by public transport. But given that the relatively small cost of the carbon offsets that we've spent relative to the overall budget of running the event, it's not. I don't really see it as a disincentive.
Paul, my question for you, a lot simpler. How do you harvest wattle seed and what do you use it for?
I was going to say that. I thought, yeah, as I sat down, I'm like, I bet the harvesting thing is the thing people were thinking of. We're actually working with, so there's three of us involved. Keith Cumming, who some of you probably know, Arborline Nursery in Hamilton. I think it's the largest native tree nursery in Australia. But he's a bit of an engineer, and he's recently been sort of commissioned to do some sort of market gardening, development of some engineering, some equipment for market gardens. He sort of does that on the side with the nursery, and he's a bit of a genius. So he's been looking at olive harvesters and almond harvesters and sort of appropriating those principles, but starting from scratch, not just taking something that's used for some other crop and trying to retrofit it, but actually building one that specifically suits wattles. So that's how we'll harvest it. And there's a few different options, whether it's hitting them or shaking the whole tree, so I'm sort of leaving that up to Keith. We've started a company to do this, but the company won't include the harvester. He's going to develop that separately, and then we'll have a sort of a preferred supplier arrangement with him that he'll harvest, the company's seed first, which will be a third his company anyway. What was the other question?
Might carry that conversation on after, if that's okay. We've got running really out of time, so we've got time for two more quick questions.
Yeah, Carolyn, you didn't mention air conditioners. I mean, we've got two running here now and people putting jackets on. You go into shops and they have it freezing cold. I mean, people need to toughen up a bit and save on the electricity and carbon credits. What's your thought?
Well, you're probably right with that in terms of your last comment. In terms of the carbon neutral event, it didn't go into the detail. It just talked basically about floor space and the electricity. It made some assumptions about the national grid in terms of how much of that is from green energy. One thing we'll explore next time is whether or not we can, because I just said, we just get all the power from the grid, even though Birchip Cropping Group have got solar panels and a microgrid, so we could probably, a lot of the time we're not drawing off the grid. So there are certainly ways to delve deeper into how much power you actually use for an event and how you could possibly offset that using your own system. But yeah, I'm not the one who's going to tell people to toughen up. You can do that.
My question is to Deanna. Is it Deanna?
Deanna.
Yep. With the Plains Wanderer, and you said the zoo is breeding captive. Myself personally, with two grandchildren who have way too much stuff and crap, in their gifts throughout the year, I usually give them like a support of something. Does the zoo have like a fund for the Plains Wanderer?
I'm not sure if they have one directly for the Plains Wanderer at the moment. They do take the gate takes, which go to Plains Wanderer Conservation. We do have a local lady in Castlemaine that produces these Plains Wanderer pins that I'm wearing, and she's donating her profits back to Trust for Nature, who are funneling them back to the farmers that are working with Plains Wanderer. So there's a few options, but you could speak to the zoo if you wanted to make a direct contribution to Plains Wanderer conservation as well.
All right, thank you.
That almost concludes our session anyway. We're running a little bit out of time. Quick question, maybe? Just one more quick one? Or a quick response?
What do we use the black wattle for? It's a secret. No, it's a food. It's a food. So there's about 20 tonne, I think, of wattle seed for human consumption at the moment. And so we'll be seeking to work out ways to get it in more places and grow the market. Yeah, there is. Yeah, there's a wattle seed magnum. Yeah, or connoisseur, one of those fancy ice creams.
Wonderful. Just like to call upon our audience to once again thank our speakers and make a quick presentation.
Oh, thank you. Oh, beautiful. Thank you. Yeah. Good deal.
Oh, geez, tell you what, you're dangerous.
Yeah, I know. I had stuff flying all over the place.
Yeah. Grab that.
Just as soon as the other session is finished, we're going to have a small panel and a wrap-up, so please just bear with us until the other sessions are finished. Gus, you come up now, then Fiona won't. Gus? Gus? He's not listening. Fiona mightn't feel so lonely if you come up as well.
Always in a panel discussion, grab a middle seat, they say.
I think we'll probably try and keep it as quick as we can. I think Have you seen Winnie?
I did actually see him at a send-off the other day.
Oh, right.
Because Anne was over in Japan.
That's right.
So he was sort of joking about the typhoon. I'm not sure hoping she'd get hit by it or escape it. I'm not sure. You can never tell. But no, he's doing well and drinking.
Yeah, no.
And looking after everyone's farm.
Yeah,
Like
that's
he gets invited to come and look after everyone's farm when they take a holiday or something. So.
Yeah, they said, come on, you big sookie. You go to Japan now.
No,
it's not
he's
interested.
not
going.
So he's saying that she'd be having overtime there. Oh, how you going? all good.
Yeah, really good. Yeah, we have made I think it's been the last 2 years have probably been pretty incredible really. That we've made the most of the moisture of the seasons that we've had to deal with. And even last year, really equivalent rainfall to 2000, or 1982, and yet we grew, a few thousand tons of crops.
And then,
and this year we're just going to have decile 4 rainfall, and probably decile 8 crops.
Yeah, no, amazing. I mean, geez, they were good through here too. It's a shame for one more decent.
Yeah.
Stop the rain.
It's certainly are in a sweet spot. We're well aware of that.
Well, you remember in 14-15 we were hanging over the border at Riverina having crackers, and it sounded like everyone gets a turn. Yeah. I'm sure we've missed out plenty of times. Yeah, that's right. Is that all good?
I reckon I ruined that for you. I don't know that my presence is entirely carbon neutral. I was thinking about all the way.
I don't know whether Caroline quite estimated that you were travelling by car, but anyway, there was a question.
You can spread the load though, because it was.
Yeah. Well, I walked.
No,
so there you go.
Well, what I was really saying is you can't attribute my entire trip to this.
No.
See?
So don't feel guilty about that. That's good. Great to have you down here.
How did you go?
It's good to get out.
Yes, I think I don't know whether Robin got there. She was planning to get there, she had to go and take the grandchild home, so she said that's what I'm going to. I don't think I've come out of there. Okay, would you like to take a seat, please? We'll have a short, sharp wrap-up of the day. I know there's been lots of information, and thanks for everyone for coming and participating, and we're probably all getting a little bit tired, but we've got an expert panel up here, and I'm not too sure where to start. But we've got a combination of presenters and of people from the audience. And what I'd like to do really is just ask them individually. Firstly, when we'll just go through, and if you just introduce yourself briefly, and really, Gabrielle Chang said this morning that it's up to us to make the policy to what we want, and where we take a day like today. What can we as individual farmers, as family members, as a community, what can we get out of today and to go forward, because it has been lots of really exciting speakers, and so I'd like some audience participation too, that if you've got some ideas that you would like pursued in your community or your farm, please contribute. So Pete, we might start right down the end there. We'll go from the northern New South Wales to Western Australia. Everywhere in between. Thanks, Peter.
Sure. I'll probably do it my way, as I do. So I just wanted to comment on the day a bit, and all I saw today, a lot of recurring themes. And I guess the big thing for me in all of this is that unless everybody out there takes some ownership, nothing's going to change fast enough. Which is kind of a morph of what Gabriel's saying about, we need to start demanding policy, but I just can't stress enough that you can't wait for someone else to do it. And it's in all of the, solving our community's problems, is we've all got to take ownership of that. And that goes right through the conversation for agriculture and rural communities generally, is that we actually need the whole of the Australian community to take responsibility for their share of what it is that we're trying to do out here too. I probably need to qualify that. I don't want to chew up all day, but we're not separate to the Australian community. Agriculture and rural communities are actually integral to the national well-being, if you like. And when people talk about agriculture, there's this natural tendency to think about farmers, and I keep saying agriculture is not about farmers, it's about communities. So, as I said, it's really important that we all take ownership of what it is and we all start to get proactive on doing something about it, whatever that little bit is, but don't wait for someone else. And I think, we need high-level policy change that's only going to be driven from here. It's not going to be driven out of Canberra. It needs to be driven from a local initiative and the local voices.
Thanks, Peter. Graham?
That's terrific. And I think, we talk a lot about the problem, but we've had 20 years of kicking the can around, and actually now it's pretty serious to get on with it. There's enough people who, get this issue, and just simple things of, reducing emissions 3% a year if it's your personal goal. It's amazing, you can find some 10% chunks in there. So that actually is the first bit, but then looking at what can we do more widely. And I like to look at, I like the saying silver buckshot, not silver bullets. There are so many different things there where this can contribute to actually helping people save some money or make their life better off, and it happens to have an added bonus of reducing emissions. And I look back at the 30-year challenge, or 40 years of the road toll of the 70s, and if you look at all of the things that have done for all the extra people driving on the roads and what's been done safer, 0.05 seat belts, speed cameras, road design, airbags, there's been heaps of things, all each contributing, evidence-based, introduced in that, and there's been grizzles every time one of those things was done, but actually we're all a lot better off for it. And that's the 30-year journey we're on with emissions. And there's a lot of people grizzling around, but today there's been some fantastic leadership, and I've especially loved the farmer stories and stuff of what they've done getting on with it, getting renewables in. The pipeline up here, that was a $500 million adaptation project, and all of the exciting stuff that underpins what can still happen in this region. You've got spare water, that's amazing. So it's been great. Thanks for offering the day.
Anthony Judd, you introduce yourself, Anthony? Yeah, you go.
CEO of the Bull Oak Shire, which obviously Birchip's one of our urban communities. So much information today. I was talking to someone over coffee before, and they said, they've learnt so much, but they're worried how their brain's going to be able to take that away. And I don't know how you feel, and I'm a bit mentally exhausted. And I think through it all, there were some great stories, and I also really appreciated the stories from farmers, which I don't think, and probably don't have a policy, but some takeaways just from our organisation that I think we can do better is just tell that story of farmers better. I reckon we do really well at telling the story of our urban communities, but they're all built on the farmers, and maybe that's not necessarily the right terminology, food producers, and celebrating what we do. From Gabrielle Chan, and talk about how many areas have done paddock to plate and do that a lot better than what we have ever done it. We probably think of a bit of lamb and a bit of grain, and we don't celebrate that as well as perhaps we should up here. I think someone said food, not commodities. So earlier, what was great is I think we all got scared through nearly every presentation about what the future holds, but everyone at the end had some opportunities. So the lawyer, which spoke to the implications for bodies such as council, but taking those opportunities away. So seeing, and the last presentation we just had was the BCG, the microgrid over there, and seeing local champions do that. And we do a lot of this work ourselves. We're about to put funding applications in for electric car charging stations, but we don't push that out. We don't celebrate that and let the community know what we're doing. And have we set enough targets ourselves? That's another question. So thanks for putting on the day. It's excellent.
Thanks, Anthony. Gus?
Glenn. Gus couldn't be with us today. Glenn Sutherland from Malacasha Management Authority. I get a chance to work with rural communities and have done over the last 40 or 50 years, including living there. Currently I'm not only a project manager that is delivering 4 sustainable agriculture projects out of Mallee, including one in partnership with Birchip Cropping Group, but also working as a regional agriculture land care facilitator, funded through the National Land Care Program, gives us a fair bit of insight in the communities and what they're facing. The take-home messages clearly, I think, today is the disconnect between what's happening in communities and the level of sophistication and understanding that our farming and relative communities have in terms of what's happening with climate and climate change, and the disconnect between that and politicians. I should put a hand over that, so I'm not a public servant when I say that sort of stuff, but the reality is we're past the point where any of us should be feeling frightened about saying what is actually the truth. And we see this in Melbourne, and there's a lot of disquiet in Melbourne, and a lot of protests are happening. And to me, the sort of information that we're getting today, the factual information we're getting today, and the amount of noise that is around trying to put those messages down, you can clearly understand the level of frustration that's occurring both within rural communities and with certain sections of the population, including school kids. Really, we do understand it. What do we do about that, I think, is maintain a clear message to our leaders that something's terribly wrong and something needs to happen. And don't be distracted from that. I mean, clearly, I very much appreciated picking up even more evidence today that I can take and talk quietly and consistently with sections of my own family, my friends, and even my community that still aren't convinced that we are looking at climate change. It's been a great day.
Fiona?
I'm Fiona from Farmers for Climate Action. We're a movement of farmers working to ensure that farmers are front and centre when it comes to climate solutions. So an event like this is so fantastic to see that we get this level of expertise that farmers are able to kind of hear in the room, and also these stories of hope. And I'm inspired all the time by the farmers I'm talking to about what they're doing on farm. Talking about the political motivation, and another thing of hope for me is one of our big campaigns for Farmers for Climate Action has been to see a national strategy for climate change and agriculture fully funded and implemented. And on Friday, the state and federal agriculture ministers endorsed a national climate change works program. And for me, that's a huge victory. And I feel that the political context is changing, and you guys can be a part of that. From what you're doing on farm, if you want to get more involved, feel free to look us up, and get in touch with BCD if there are more things you want to hear about, or us. And there are so many avenues for here, so I hope you take advantage of those.
Alison?
Alison Kennedy from the National Centre for Farmer Health. So unfortunately, I've only been here for this afternoon's session, but what I took from that was the value of empowering individuals and empowering communities and to make amazing changes, and to have an opportunity sort of to reflect and to learn and to implement new strategies. And I think building on that, I think we can all take inspiration from those success stories as well, and share those successes to inspire other communities and other individuals to take action as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Alison. Stuart?
I think it is about collaboration, and the opportunities are just immense. The problems are mind-boggling if we don't make changes. But I think we just really do need to get that cooperative approach going, and as we as primary producers and our communities that surround us have a major role to play in offering solutions, and to be part of those solutions, to bring food back to be produced in a way that does renew and regenerate the carbon, and sink, get that going. We need to get revegetation of trees going through in large areas of landscape again, to sort of get those water cycles and drop the pressures so the fronts can come back in. We can solve this, and we can also work with the big business and get that carbon market going. so that we can, so we can repair a lot of the damage that we've done in food production. But we just need to explain why that's important a lot better. But I think it's happening, and it's really, really exciting.
Thanks, Stuart. I'd like to invite comments from the audience that what you might do when you get home or what you'd like to do. So we've got microphones there. Would anyone like to make a comment?
It's more a question than a comment. But I think, Peter, you mentioned, was it your brother was involved in Beeline? Yeah. So my question is, in addition to so much that as farmers we can do, and the importance of all these responses to the challenges of climate change, perhaps we might say that Australia didn't benefit as much from the autosteer technologies as the originator as we might have. There are probably other companies and countries that took that technology and commercially benefited from it more, and maybe even practices like zero-till we've been world-leading adopters of, but if you calculated the value of those ecosystem services, we probably didn't get properly paid for that either. I'd like to hear if there are any comments on the panel about, in addition to us as producers, farmers, managers of the land, are there also broader economic opportunities to grab hold of?
So I think one of the things that's really missing in the conversation around opportunities for agriculture to lead in, and following from Stuart's comments I suppose too, is that one of the points I made in my presentation was that farming practices are determined largely by public policy and market forces. And lots of people expect that we will deliver better sustainability outcomes and better eco-services and better biodiversity outcomes and better soil carbon outcomes. But at this point, there really isn't a mature conversation about how to pay for that, because the system that we've got has been a mining system, and it's been driven by short-term thinking and trying to push productivity beyond potentially the system's capability. So you're right, but what I also know from experience and repeated experience is that if we wait for someone else to create the framework or the context for how that's going to work, the likely outcome is that we won't receive the benefit of it. That's why we need to lead ourselves, and we need to start laying that out pretty clearly in policy discussions and conversations. The people in Canberra occupy the seat. They don't necessarily lead. Community action and community-driven outcomes will happen in spite of the leadership that's being displayed. And really, the people in the room here are the drivers for that. And I can't stress that enough. If you wait for other people to solve your problem, you won't benefit from the solution as well as you will if you start to take ownership of those solutions yourself. And agriculture has got this problem generally that in the broader Australian community, we are seen as a problem, not the solution. And we are very much the solution to the problems, but we need to be empowered, and we need to start telling people why it's important and how best to achieve it. And if we're not careful, we'll lose control of that conversation irreparably. So, but I agree with you. Look, we are very poor at capitalising and getting the full benefit for our communities. And I think that's really important, that agriculture, as I keep saying, it's not about farmers, it's about communities. So, bringing capital, bringing cash into the system, into the community, and making that an opportunity for the next generation is really critical. And people who glibly talk it up with no real substance to how to achieve it, they're not helping. So we've got to get busy and we've got to take ownership.
Any other panel members like to make some comments?
Well, I'll just talk about that, the knowledge and the important role Australia has, because, you hear some people say we're a small percentage of the emissions globally, so, we really shouldn't bother. But we don't say that for terrorism or global health or all sorts of other things. We're heavy hitters on the global stage, and we should be leaders. And we're a wealthy nation. We've got brilliant thinking. We can be incredibly smart in agriculture. And part of that, of us getting our act together, is a huge export opportunity. And, in terms of helping the rest of the world, because what we do here won't be enough because it's global food production for all of Asia and India. There is huge sort of, potential pathways that can go down that's going to need really good innovation in there, and that's an opportunity. And it's interesting, in the last 20 years, Australia discovered that knowledge actually is an export industry, and so the education industry is, huge now. And so that's there before us now, but, that needs a fair old kickstart in terms of how we support that, and do that, because, probably the research focus nationally and some of the things today and what Mark was talking about, has declined. So the support that, groups like BCG and others need to get on and have this good sort of research and capture that and be in a position to export it, there's, it needs all parties at the table.
I think it's time that the conversation's had about who provides the money, who has to pay. Ultimately, when you're talking about food production, you're talking about the people that benefit. And you're talking about the retail sector, you're talking about the whole supply chain. And is it time that we had the conversation about producers, supply chain and consumers having a fair contribution to the cost of reducing carbon?
Any other comments from the panel? Mark, I think you had a question, Mark Remnant.
Yeah, probably just a comment. There was a great take-home line, I thought, early in the day, which went, denial and despair both lead to inaction. And I thought today, what we got out of today was just a very powerful, very realistic summation of where we're at, but also that capacity for us to take home that within our industry, our organisations and our communities, each of us has got some capacity to do what we can within our circumstances to address it. And I think if each of us take that home today, then we'll do our little bit and we'll appreciate the efforts of others, and we'll be prepared to continue to advocate for some positive response to the climate.
Thank you.
I came here today because I'm a grandmother and I'm trying to find my way and my voice in this, given that I have a biological investment in seeing my great-great-great-great-grandchildren live well on this planet. And so I took the day off my job because I really wanted to see how I could find my way in. When I reflect on Greta Thunberg and her on the other end of the age spectrum from me as a 67-year-old grandmother of 6, I'm going, there's a place I can stand in here that has power beyond logic to make, because of just the anger and the ferocious commitment of the grandmothers speak. This is not good enough. And I, for a while, I was ringing Scott Morrison's office at 8 a.m. every Monday morning, like the nag, my greatest. But I'm finding what I could do, and that's my comment. And my question is there a grandmothers group? I'm looking for something rural, and there's a couple of us in stall looking for a pathway. Do we sit on the steps of the town hall there with, what do we do? I don't want it too angry. I can be angry and emotional here, but I don't want it out there. And I'm reading this and I'm seeing that there's a very low compared with the rest of Victoria, low proportion of even get that it's a problem in the Wimmera Mallee. So, somehow there's got to be a way for the quiet women, the elders, to speak and know, wow, there's something here, there's a problem, because there's an unharnessed energy, and that's the elders. So anyway, I'm having a big passionate thing, but is there a group anywhere?
I think you've
Deanna,
heard the name of them, but I know there is a group. The Knitting Nanas. The Knitting Nanas. I was thinking of the Parents for Climate Action, but the Knitting Nanas is probably...
That's a group that formed around coal seam gas, but
use the microphone, thanks, Pete.
sorry. I mean, the Knitting Nanas are a group that formed around coal seam grass, but also, it's about climate and stewardship and, providing a better future for the next generation. So, they're there. There are groups that like that. That's just one example. I mean, it was grandmothers who got together and started becoming activists, and some of them have put themselves on the line and been arrested and all sorts of stuff to, in social, disruption stuff, which is really good. And I think it's a lot. It's quite powerful when nanas turn up and start protesting, because it's pretty hard to say they're being irresponsible. Yeah.
Yeah, it's important to be involved, but it's something I think we've all feeling that powerless or feel angry when people aren't listening. And I think it was probably only a few weeks ago, because sometimes you really want to respond to some comments, and but you just realise that you're never going to win an argument with some people. So I guess where I've come to is that there's a lot of people out there that are sitting on the fence or quiet. So there's two strategies. You find people that are doing stuff and being positive and lead by example and just get the job done. That, I think, is the number one priority, and lead by example, because we're all time poor, and let's focus our energy in a positive way rather than a negative way. Just accept that some people don't want to listen. There's never a black and white to most things. You can always find a counter argument if you ignore lots of other things. So, sometimes you're not going to shift people's paradigm. You've got to work where the people are and put all your energy into positive outcomes and lead by example, and then people will follow.
And just to add, if you do ever kind of struck by inspiration, you want to have a voice in the media, you want to talk to your local MP, Farmers for Climate Action is a group that can help you do that. So we work with Pete very frequently, don't we, Pete?
Take one. Is there any more comments? Because I think it's been a long day.
Just to top off on your comments about the politicians, you're spot on. We worked out years ago, politicians are monkeys and the electorate's the organ grinder, and we got to write the music. That's it in a nutshell. And so we need to, up till now, your NFF, people that represent you, and your VFF and all the rest of them, and I've been part of it, and half your National Party politicians, they've never been part of the solution. They're part of the problem, and we've got to turn that around. So we need to do it.
Thank you. On that, I'd like to close the event, and I'd really like to especially thank our partners, Mallee CMA, North Central CMA, the Bullock Shire, the Federal Government Drought Communities Program, GWM Water for the water, and I'd like to pay special thanks to the BCG staff and everyone else who's helped from the Shire and the CMA today. Thank you. I'm sure that we've all had a good day, and we've got plenty of information to work with and going forward. And finally, thanks to our final panellists here that have all contributed freely, willingly and honestly. So thank you once again.